Language is not just a neutral mode of communication. It can be a powerful force that perpetuates bias, discrimination, and even racism. Racism, at its core, is a system of advantage and disadvantage based on perceived racial differences, and language often becomes a tool to maintain or resist these power imbalances. When we examine the intersection of language and racism, we gain insights into how deeply embedded prejudice can be in everyday speech and thought. Language is never merely about grammar or pronunciation. It's about identity, belonging, and social values. From slang terms that are adopted but poorly understood, to the deliberate use of racially charged epithets, every linguistic choice carries weight. Historically, systems of power have relied on language to control, marginalize, or erase certain groups of people. Colonizers suppressed indigenous languages to weaken cultural identities and assert dominance. Governments promoted or outlawed certain tongues to unify or homogenize populations. Parents, teachers, and community leaders often dismissed dialects or accents as uneducated or incorrect, sending messages about whose voices truly matter. Within these dynamics, racial hierarchies became woven into the fabric of communication. The words and phrases that emerged from these hierarchies persist in contemporary speech, sometimes in ways that are explicit and easily recognized as hateful, but often in subtle forms that many speakers fail to notice. The story of language and racism is thus not just a story of overt slurs and insults, but of hidden assumptions, microaggressions, and deeply ingrained patterns of thought. During the era of European colonialism, colonizers often imposed their language on colonized peoples. This was not a random process. Forbidding local languages and discouraging their use in public life were tactics meant to strip people of cultural dignity and push them into adopting the colonizer's worldview. The labeling of indigenous languages as inferior or barbaric underpinned racist ideologies and justified domination. Take for instance how the Spanish or English languages were elevated into colonized regions, while native languages were stigmatized. Entire generations grew up in societies where speaking their mother tongue was considered a sign of backwardness. Those who wanted social mobility felt forced to abandon their linguistic and cultural roots. This kind of linguistic assimilation was never just a matter of convenience, it was an extension of racial and cultural oppression. Over time, these attitudes lingered, producing a legacy where language associated with white or European ancestry holds prestige, while languages linked to non-white populations are seen as less professional or valuable. In contemporary society, African American vernacular English is one of the most discussed examples of language and racism. African American vernacular English has distinct grammatical structures, vocabulary, and cultural significance. Yet because it is associated with the black community, it has frequently been labeled as incorrect or slang, rather than recognized as a legitimate dialect with historical depth. Students who speak this variety of English in classrooms may be penalized or told that they need to fix their speech to fit standardized English norms, implying their natural way of talking is substandard. These criticisms are rarely just about the mechanics of language. They reveal embedded judgments about race, class, and intelligence. Individuals who code switch, switching between African American vernacular English and standardized English based on context, often do so to avoid discrimination or to navigate spaces where their manner of speaking could prompt bias. Code switching itself becomes another layer in the complex relationship between identity and language. The decision to modify one's speech can be an act of self-preservation in a racially stratified environment. Another example arises with Spanish speakers in the United States, who sometimes face suspicion or scorn simply for speaking Spanish in public. Phrases like, "This is America, speak English," are loaded with racism and xenophobia. They imply that non-English speakers are not truly American, and they also ignore the historical fact that Spanish was spoken in parts of what is now the United States long before English. Furthermore, the hostility towards Spanish in certain regions is often linked to stereotypes about Latin communities. Even bilingual children face tension, as schools sometimes discourage the use of Spanish outside of foreign language classes. This policing of language has consequences. It can create an environment where bilingual children feel shame or confusion about their cultural heritage and identity. Over time, these repeated messages about English supremacy reinforce social narratives that one language, and by extension one cultural group, is more desirable or worthy than another. They are often small, subtle comments or questions that might not appear hostile at first glance, but carry racist implications. For example, repeatedly asking a person of colour, "Where are you really from?" implies they are perpetual foreigners who do not truly belong in the broader society in which they are living. Using backhanded compliments that highlight racial or ethnic stereotypes, such as praising someone's English as surprisingly good, also undercuts the individual's sense of belonging. These everyday forms of communication may seem insignificant, yet their cumulative effect can be psychologically draining. Their very subtlety makes it harder for victims to call them out without being dismissed as overly sensitive or confrontational. In this way, language can operate as a vehicle for racism, without needing slurs or overt insults. Stereotypes often survive through linguistic shortcuts, words, phrases, or idioms that reduce entire groups to caricatures. When repeated enough, these linguistic habits distort public perception and reinforce bigotry. Media outlets sometimes perpetuate bias by using racially coded language, for instance, describing black protesters as thugs or Latino immigrants as illegals. Such labels ignore the complexity of social issues and pin negative traits onto specific communities. Even news coverage of certain neighborhoods, where phrases like dangerous, sketchy, or crime-ridden get thrown around, reveals how racist assumptions become normalized. This language feeds into a vicious cycle. If society grows accustomed to hearing communities described in negative terms, it becomes easier to rationalize discriminatory policies and attitudes towards those communities. Social media plays a major role in shaping contemporary discourse around language and racism. Platforms like X, TikTok, or Instagram amplify both harmful and transformative language practices at an unprecedented speed. Racial slurs can trend, but so can movements for inclusion and awareness. Hashtags challenging racist language use gain traction, with users calling out public figures or brands. On the flip side, trolls, bots, or extremist groups leverage social media to spread hateful rhetoric. The immediacy of online communication sometimes encourages careless words or jokes that perpetuate racist tropes. However, social media can also offer a space for marginalized voices to educate, mobilize, and share experiences about linguistic discrimination. The key lies in recognizing the power of these platforms to both harm and heal through the words we choose. Inclusive language is not a superficial trend, but a deliberate effort to dismantle the biases baked into our vocabularies. Advocates for inclusive language encourage us to rethink labels that objectify or stereotype. They challenge terms like illegal alien, suggesting alternatives like undocumented immigrant, which focus on legal status rather than dehumanizing a person. They push for recognition of gender-neutral pronouns, bridging the gap between linguistic tradition and the evolving understanding of identity. The goal is not to police language, but to raise awareness that our words have real consequences in shaping attitudes. Critics might see these efforts as excessive politeness or political correctness, but proponents argue that changing how we speak is essential to changing how we think and act. After all, if our social structures are interwoven with language, any attempt to address racism must also include reflection on the words we use daily. None of this is to say that language alone is the root cause of racism. Economic disparities, historical injustices, and political power struggles all play vital roles. Still, language is a lens that reveals how these inequalities manifest in everyday life. By paying attention to linguistic patterns, we uncover the subtle ways people are demeaned, excluded, or stereotyped. Raising awareness about linguistic racism is a step toward broader social reform, because addressing how we talk can prompt us to address how we think. When we confront and unlearn racist language, we're also taking a step to dismantling racist ideologies and structures. This process isn't always comfortable, and not everybody wants to immediately conform. It involves examining our own biases and questioning habits that might feel normal. But at the end of the day, it offers the possibility of meaningful, transformative change.